Was Desmond Ridder pressing versus the Panthers, and was the Falcons' defensive success owed more to their pressure or their coverage? We're breaking down the Week 1 All-22 film on today's Locked On Falcons.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Jace Medical. Empower yourself when you purchase a Jace case, providing you with a personal supply of 5 antibiotics that treat 50 plus infections. Get yours today at jacemedical.com. That's JASE medical.com. So, guys, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman. Used to cover the Falcons for many years over at falcfans.com, RIP. Still going strong on this illustrious podcast. You may also know me as Sirius Black. You may also know me as Mr. Holier Than Thou. And you may also know me as Mr. Drew. My friends call me Negative Nancy, but you can call me Mr. Drew. But you can become one of my friends by becoming an everydayer of this illustrious podcast and listening to this podcast as your first listen each and every day. And all you got to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today is the All-22 review. And before we dive into film, I will give you a heads up for those of you that are new everydayers on this podcast that weren't listening to this show last week. We do these film reviews each and every week, but you're not going to see actual film on this YouTube broadcast. I will post clips, it's copyright issues. I will post clips of the plays that I'm discussing on Twitter, on my FalcFans Twitter, and I should be able to pin a comment with links to those clips on Wednesday. But here's one of the perks of if you're a subscriber to Subtext, you will get access to an extended version of this film breakdown on YouTube that should be posted either late Tuesday or early Wednesday. And you'll get the same plays, but you'll get HD versions of that on this show, as well as more in-depth analysis. You'll also get extra breakdowns, extra plays getting broken down. For example, my goal is to showcase some of the protection issues as well as some of the spacing issues that plagued this offense in week 1. And so I think Subtext is definitely worth your time. It's $4.99 a month. Basically, if you're only getting it to get those extended film reviews, you're paying $1.25 a week. Is that worth it? And especially you're getting the first 2 of those for free because you get a 14-day free trial when you sign up with the link in the description below. So check it out. But the brunt of today's offensive breakdown on the Falcons film is going to be focusing on the quarterback, Desmond Ridder's issues. And it's not because there weren't other factors that were holding back this offense in week 1. Someone on Subtext earlier today asked me sort of how much would you split the difference between Ridder's issues and the protection issues. And I told him, for me personally, it's like 50% Desmond Ridder, 35% protection, 15% play calling or other. And again, that's another value of subscribing to Subtext, getting that direct feedback. Again, click the link in the description below if you want to join that. But so much of the season is going to be about Desmond Ridder's development. So I think it's worthwhile to talk about Desmond Ridder's development and talking about the quarterback. And I don't think you necessarily need me to go too deep into Caleb McGarry getting beat by Brian Burns when he lined up in a wide 9 technique. That feels very obvious that, one of the things we strive to do on this podcast is go beyond sort of the surface level analysis on this podcast. And as far as the play calling goes, which I think has been somewhat fairly criticized, but I will defend at least one criticism of Arthur Smith, which is I've heard from various folks that they didn't use enough play action. I think some of that is owed to them trying to get Ridder into a rhythm with some quicker, easier throws than necessarily those more longer developing plays off of play action. But we'll break down a couple of plays that show some of my concerns with Desmond Ridder's decision-making in this game. And the very first one was the first snap of the game, where the Falcons were running a mesh concept out of 22 personnel. Keith Smith, the fullback, was lined up at the tight end position. And mesh is basically you have 2 crossing underneath receivers. You had Michael Pruitt lined up on the left that was going to the right. You had Kyle Pitts lined up on the right that was going to the left. And if you watch the play from the end zone angle, you'll see sort of right before Ridder throws the ball, you'll see his eyes go to the right to look at where Pruitt is going to wind up. But then when you actually look at the trajectory of the throw, he's throwing it directly ahead. So the only conclusion I can have is that he's throwing it to Keith Smith. Now, this was the play that was batted down at the line of scrimmage. And I think it was fortunate that it was batted down, because if that ball does not get batted, I think Frankie Louvu, the Panthers linebacker, is reading Ridder's eyes, and he's prepared to jump that throw and potentially make an interception. So I don't think the game Ridder got off to the best start, right? I know Pro Football Focus only charted one turnover-worthy pass from Ridder in this game. I don't think it was this first play. But I would probably argue that Ridder deserves 2, because I think this was a turnover-worthy decision, even if the pass wasn't necessarily in a position to get picked off because it was batted down. I think the play that they did chart, I'm guessing, was his first pass of the third quarter, this was an instance where Ridder similarly kind of tried to force the ball into coverage to a crosser to Kyle Pitts over the middle between 2 linebackers. I don't really know why he made that decision. It was a very small closing window over the middle. He had an open check down to his left to Bijan Robinson in the flat. And so these are signs of Ridder kind of pressing not only on the first play of the first half, the first play of the second half. And so we did see Ridder kind of settle down later in the third quarter. You started to see him get in a rhythm. There was a play at the end of the third quarter. It was a 2nd and 8 where he hit a wide open Kyle Pitts in the flat for a 10-yard gain. He reads the defender being in off coverage, easy read, make the throw. First down for the Falcons. And then on the very next play, though, the issues came again, where the Falcons ran, from my vantage, the exact same play. The defender's off, Kyle Pitts runs into the flat, but Ridder doesn't pull the trigger, right? Instead, he scrambles to his left, escapes the pocket, finds an open Tyler Algier on the move for a 12-yard gain. Now, maybe he didn't pull the trigger because the defender was cheating down a little bit more, but I don't think that defender was in a position to jump that throw if Ridder makes an accurate throw. But maybe he cheats down enough that instead of a 10-yard gain like it was on the previous play, it's maybe a 6-yard gain or 8-yard gain. He's able to make that tackle much more quickly after the catch. But even though you can sit there and say we got a better result with a seemingly 12-yard gain from Tyler Algier versus a potential 6 or 8-yard gain to Kyle Pitts, we're more about process over results, because process is much more predictive of future outcomes than solely looking at results. And so I want to make it clear, it wasn't all bad for Desmond Ridder, right? I don't think his accuracy was great, specifically on the passes to Matt Collins. There was a couple of throws to Matt Collins that was off the mark, but we're just going to believe that that's something that can be improved with building with more reps, right? Building that rapport and improving the timing that he has with these new receivers. So that should get better with time. And I do think upon rewatching the game that deep ball to Pitts at the end of the game was a well-placed ball. I think he threw the ball right to the spot where he needed to, where only Kyle Pitts could go get that. So despite all this criticism of Desmond Ridder, he did check one of the boxes that we were wanting to see him check this season, which is that deep ball. 100% hit rate on the one deep shot he took in his games. So we'll take what we can get with that. He's off to a great start, at least as far as that concerns. But circling back to some of the concerns, I'm sure some of you guys are listening or watching and being like, okay, Aaron, you outlined like 3 questionable pass plays. Is that a big deal? It may not be a big deal, right? But I think for me personally, it's a little frustrating because these were the types of plays that Ridder seemingly was doing well last year. Like these were non-issues last year. And I wouldn't say that that's necessarily a sign that he's regressing or anything. Like, again, maybe we just brush it off as week 1 jitters. Maybe he's pressing a little bit, but where my brain kind of goes, guys, is, was his pressing related to the pressure that Carolina was bringing early in the game? As you guys may recall, a consistent through line throughout the Matt Ryan era was that when defenses were able to get after him early and basically punch him in the mouth, right, it led to happier feet and poorer decisions, a speedier clock, and all those various things. And you saw a downturn in Matt Ryan's play. And was that the issue with Desmond Ridder in this game? And is that going to be an issue in the future? Now, we don't know the answer to that question quite yet because we don't have a big sample size of Ridder getting pressured a lot, right? I know in this game, PFF said that he was only pressured on 23% of his dropbacks. I personally would put that number at 27% because one higher, one play more. But that doesn't paint an accurate portrait of the first half where, at least by my count, all the pressure occurred, right? So that number of pressure in terms of his first half dropbacks was closer to 40% in the first half, right? Now PFF would probably put it at 36%. I would put it at 43, split the difference 40%. So, we only had one game last year where Ridder was pressured at a similar rate. That was the Week 18 game against the Bucs. Once again, it was hurricane season, Hurricane Tryon on McGarry Island that game. It was Hurricane Burns on McGarry Island this week. But we saw in that Bucs game, Ridder did a good job handling that pressure by extending plays outside the pocket, using his mobility. And so it raises questions for me, at least, in the future when we deal with pressure like this. And this isn't going to be the last time the Falcons have to handle a high degree of pressure, guys. They face some really good pass rushes this year. That is definitely apparent. Is it going to be more something of Ridder's mobility is going to kind of, eliminate that and make that mostly a non-issue, or are we going to get more games like this where he might start pressing a little bit, a la Matt Ryan did throughout his career? So we don't necessarily have answers to those questions right now, and for that reason, you're not going to hear me say, we need to make a referendum on Desmond Ridder. We need to draw final conclusions on this thing. I think in the meantime, we just need to be patient. We'll find those answers over the course of the coming weeks and months this upcoming season. And we'll talk a little bit more about the need for patience with the Falcons offense at the end of today's episode. But we'll continue today's Locked On podcast looking at the defense, flipping the script, and talking about the Falcons defense's ability to generate pressure and how it impacted this game. And we'll get into that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So our partners over at eBay Motors have teamed up with Locked On Fantasy Football host Vinny Iyer to bring you some of the best fantasy picks each week, all season long. And whether you're prepping for the draft or you're scouting the waiver wire, every week we're going to provide you with players that are guaranteed to fit your roster. So let's see who Vinny Iyer has picked for us in this week's eBay's Guaranteed Fit Fantasy Picks of the Week. And this one is very personal to me. I'm going to ride or die with Bengals wide receiver T. Higgins, who got 8 targets and put up 0 fantasy points in week 1 on my fantasy teams against a very tough Browns secondary. But he gets a big shot to rebound big time against the Ravens this week at home. The Texans had a lot of success throwing outside against the Ravens secondary, and Higgins has a history of massive volume versus Baltimore when healthy. So stick with T. Higgins as your ride or die in what should be a high-scoring affair this week against the Ravens. Now, Vinny Iyer from Locked On Fantasy Football is helping us win your fantasy football championship, and eBay Motors knows a championship team is about each player being a perfect fit, and the same is true of your vehicle. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you can make sure your ride stays running smoothly. Air filters, brakes, batteries, taillights, alternator, shock struts, whatever your baby needs, eBay Motors has it. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, it's guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money back. Plus, at these prices, you're burning rubber, not cash. So keep your ride or die alive at ebay.com/motors. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers, eligible items only, exclusions apply. So let's talk a little bit more about the defense and the pressure. And as many of you guys know, that I plan to continue doing this. I have been charting the Falcons defensive coverages since the 2019 season. But we may have to take a couple more weeks before we get too deeply into the Falcons coverages, right? Over the last 8 years, I have basically been mastering middle of the field coverage, middle of the field close coverages, right? But now we're in a middle of the field open or split safety world under new defensive coordinator Ryan Nielsen. So some of the nuances of those coverages are a little lost to me. Sometimes I'm watching like, is that cover 4 match? Is that match quarters, or is that cover 5? So I need to go back to school and educate myself on some of these nuances. So it's probably going to take us a couple of more weeks before we can parse through to give you some of that accurate coverage information here on the podcast. But in the meantime, we'll focus primarily on the front and the pressure. And the Falcons finished this game, according to my charting, pressuring Bryce Young on about 42% of his 43 dropbacks. Longtime listeners know that, in my opinion, hitting 35% pressure rate or higher is good. So 42% is a good number. Pro Football Focus put the Falcons pressure rate at 45% on 42 dropbacks. I'm assuming they're not counting that fumble on the botched exchange on the opening drive as a pass play. And they also are giving the Falcons credit for 19 pressures instead of 18 like myself. So we're not far off. Some weeks me and PFF are not on the same page, but this week we're pretty much on the same page when it comes to the pressures. But one of the things that was notable was how much pressure the Falcons were able to generate in the fourth quarter alone. Now, based off of my charting, the Falcons only pressured Young on 7 of his 25 dropbacks through the first 3 quarters. That's a 28% pressure rate. So again, that's below that acceptable 35% rate. In the fourth quarter, though, the pressure rate was 61%, which is well above that acceptable 35% rate. And if you're curious, what was the Falcons' overall pressure rate last year? According to my charting, it was 32%. There were 9 games last year where they failed to hit that 35% pressure rate or above last year. So clearly the pressure in week 1, especially when the Falcons were rushing for it, was not quite to the level that we want it to be, especially in those first 3 quarters when they were predominantly relying on their 4-man pressures. And, I think some of that is owed to people kind of underestimating Carolina's offensive line because they were overrating how predictive the preseason is, right? Carolina's offensive line, according to PFF, was ranked 15th in the league last year. And so I think people overrated the idea that they were going to be this massive liability going into the season. But, I think the conclusion that many will reach is maybe we need to dial up more blitzes. And especially given that our pass rush looked better in the fourth quarter when we were bringing more pressure, bringing more of those blitzes. And it is true that we did bring more pressure in the fourth quarter than we did prior to that. We only brought pressure 3 times in the first 3 quarters combined. So a blitz rate of about 12%. In the fourth quarter, they blitzed 4 times, and that's almost double the blitz rate, roughly 22%. So I think it's easy to, and kind of lazy maybe, to conclude some causality, which we blitz more, we got more pressure. But I think this is why you got to watch the film, because the Falcons did blitz twice on the opening drive. In fact, in the first 4 pass plays that Carolina had, and they got burned on both of those blitzes. And so I think they adjusted by saying, let's just be content to rush 4 and let's let our coverage lock down Carolina's weak wide receiver core, and that proved very effective. If you look at the first 3 quarters combined, Carolina's success rate on the 3 plays where the Falcons blitz, their success rate was 67%, which is very good. And when the Falcons only rushed 4 or less, their success rate was 28%, which is very bad, right? So essentially, the defense was 2.5 times more effective rushing 4 through the first 3 quarters than they were when they were blitzing. So again, rushing 4 was the most effective method of doing so, but it wasn't because they were able to get effective pressure. It was mostly because they were able to play good coverage, right? So I think the main takeaway we need to have from week 1, why was the Falcons defense as effective as it was in week 1? It's mostly due to good coverage on the back end. And I don't know if that's particularly sustainable given the likelihood that we'll see improved and increased quality of quarterback and receiver core in the coming weeks. So I think it is important in the future that the pass rush does a little bit better, especially when they're only rushing 4, of getting pressure on the quarterback, as well as the Falcons hopefully will be more effective blitzing so that they're not getting burned, living by the sword, dying by the sword, that sort of thing. So if you're confused a little bit on why we're making this distinction between the first 3 quarters and the fourth quarter, it's because in the fourth quarter, Carolina became very one-dimensional. After the Falcons built their 7-10 lead, prior to that point, they were much more balanced offense. And we know that defense by nature is reacting, right? It's reactive. And so if you know what's coming, i.e., the pass is coming, it's much easier for you to react and plan accordingly. So through the first 3 quarters, Carolina called runs on 48% of their offensive plays. They did maintain some balance going into the fourth quarter after the 17-10 lead with the 50-50 run pass balance on their next 2 series. But then the Falcons went up 24-10 and they completely abandoned the run. They only ran the ball 13% of their remaining plays. And so their overall run pass balance in the fourth quarter was 25% run versus 75% pass. And notably, once the Falcons went up 24-10, if you look at their pressure rate after that point, they had a 69% pressure rate. Nice. So when we look ahead to Green Bay, right, a couple of stats from Pro Football Focus jump out to me from week 1. Jordan Love was the second least pressured quarterback in week 1. He was only pressured on 20% of his dropbacks against the Bears, but he was the lowest graded quarterback according to PFF while under pressure. Now, we don't have a huge sample size of Jordan Love, given that he hasn't played a ton over the last 3 years, and week 1 included. But when you do look at what we do have seen from Jordan Love in limited offerings, his PFF grades under pressure have been very low over those 3 years. So if we're going to plant our flag on one key to victory right now, heading into week 2, we got to get pressure on the quarterback, and it has to get better moving forward if we're going to have success against Green Bay, equal success or greater success against Green Bay as we had against the Carolina Panthers. So that is going to do it for our film breakdown. We're going to wrap up today's episode talking about why we need to be a little bit more patient with Desmond Ridder, Arthur Smith, and the Falcons passing attack moving forward in the early part of the season. And we'll get into that to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Now, I want to tell you guys about Jace Medical, and recently there have been issues with supply chain shortages, natural disasters like hurricanes and wildfires, pandemics, or maybe you find yourself traveling and being in an unfamiliar place that doesn't have access to life-saving medications, and you need to be more prepared now than ever. And I personally deal with sinus infections and ear infections a bunch, and I don't want to have to worry about not being able to get the antibiotics that I need, and Jace Medical has my back. All I got to do is go online, it's simple, fill out a form, and I get prescription life-saving medications sent right to my door. And they got the Jace case, and that's where you can keep all the meds and antibiotics that they send you. It gives you peace of mind so that you have access to medication in an emergency, and you can save more than $360 by getting these life-saving medications and antibiotics with Jace Medical. Plus, you get an additional $20 off by using our promo code Locked On at checkout at jacemedical.com. That's JASE medical.com, promo code Locked On. Guys, I want to tell you about Prize Picks, which is a fun new way to play daily fantasy. And what I like about Prize Pick is it's quick, it's simple, right? You just pick two or more players and you pick whether or not they get more or less than their projected stats. It's quick, it takes less than a minute, and you get your money back quick. And especially when you're earning up to 25 times your money on your entries, it's great to have that extra money in your pocket. And if you want to play this week's entry with the Falcons, you can project Bijan Robinson's 64.5 rushing yards, more or less. Whatever you take, head on over to Prize Picks, the #1 daily fantasy sports app, just by going to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use the code LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. That's prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL, or use promo code LockedOnNFL in all lowercase. Prize Picks, daily fantasy made easy. So wrapping up today's Locked On Falcons, I'm going to talk a little bit about, the healthy amount of criticism I've seen for the Falcons week 1 performance, especially in their passing attack. We talked about this a little bit on yesterday with Scott Barra at AtlantaFalcons.com. And, started out today's episode expressing my own criticisms of the Falcons passing attack. So I'm sure some of you guys have already posted comments about, that's not fair. Why are you complaining? We won the game, blah, 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 blah. And one thing you'll never hear on this illustrious podcast is, hey, we won, you're not allowed to be critical, right? If that's how you think, then this is definitely not the podcast for you, right? You can already unsubscribe and stop being an everydayer, because if that's how you see it. But, I do think some of the criticism should be tempered somewhat, because I do think we need to be more patient, right? And if you just look back at recent history, especially with Arthur Smith, it does take the Falcons a couple of weeks to sort of spool up their passing game, right? You go back to 2021, and I'll admit I was complaining about it throughout those first couple of weeks of the game, but they started to get things going that week 4 game against Washington. But those first 3 weeks, yes, I was very loud in complaining about it, but I've learned my lesson. Now you go back to last year, right? The first 2 weeks, it was a little rough, right? It took them, most of the criticisms were about, we got to get Kyle Pitts the ball, right? And then you started seeing things start to click in week 3 against Seattle and whatever. And so I think we kind of know that it's going to take 3 or 4 weeks roughly for them to get things going, right? And, one of the things you constantly hear me say on the podcast, yes, beggars can't be choosers, but not that today, is like, you hear me talk about you can control what you can control. And frankly, from my perspective, you can't control whether or not the Falcons get off to a fast start each and every year, but I can control my expectations on how fast that start is going to be. And so if I know it's going to take a couple of weeks, I can set my expectation. Okay, it's going to take 3 or 4 weeks for us to see this passing offense get going. It always seemed to do, not just under Arthur Smith, but even if you go back beyond it, right? When the last time the Falcons got out to a hot start, at least from a passing standpoint, in week 1, arguably 2015, right? Now, I've heard some people say, oh, well, look at other teams, look at other quarterbacks. I just think that's kind of a lazy excuse. Like, you don't care. I don't care about other teams and other quarterbacks, right? You only care about the Atlanta Falcons. So I say, just look at the Atlanta Falcons. The last time their offense, their passing attack clicked in week 1 was 2015, right? Again, I know some people are like, well, didn't they do that last year? It wasn't really the passing attack. Mariota was okay in that game. It was really CP in the running game, as well as the pass rush, that made us get out to that fast start against the Saints last year. But if you go back to that, even that 2015 game, the last time our passing attack was clicking, it was really just Julio Jones clicking and cooking Byron Maxwell against the Eagles. And that's the reason why Julio is the GOAT. Like, you can't see he's on the GOAT wall, right? Right. He just kind of like, it used to be that Julio would just kind of carry the offense for the first couple of weeks until they would start getting going. That's why he's Julio Jones, right? So I guess my advice is, I think we need to be a little bit more patient. We just need to give it a couple more weeks, again, 2-3 weeks, whatever it is, right? And I just feel like we should kind of know that by this point in time. So we should set our expectations accordingly. And so, part of this is because I kind of predicted a slow start for the Falcons. I predicted them, if you missed that episode last week, I predicted them to start the season 1-3. And so if they drop the next 3, I'm sure there's probably going to be a lot less panic on this podcast than it is elsewhere in the fan base, because I expected that to happen. Right now, I also predicted that after that 1-3 start, they would win 5 of their next 6. And, maybe they win 4 of their next 6 after that point, and that's probably fine. Now, if they only win like 3 out of their next 6, then we're probably going to see me panicking a little bit more at that point in time. But, another thing that would probably cause me to panic a little bit is if the injury bug hits them over the next couple of games, and that limits their ability to win 5 of their next 6, that sort of thing. So that will be something, we'll cross that bridge, if hopefully we don't have to cross that bridge, but if we get to it. So, we all have high expectations for this team. I predicted them to finish 10-7 this year. But I don't think anybody should be expecting it should be like a smooth sailing to 10 wins this year, right? It's going to be a roller coaster. It's going to be a bumpy ride to get to that level. And I just think we as fans just need to embrace that aspect of basically being fans. It's going to be highs and lows, and just kind of embrace trying to enjoy that ride, that sort of bumpy ride, and finding the good things in enjoying that bumpy ride. So again, not saying that you're not allowed to complain, because again, I wouldn't be where I am right now as this illustrious podcast host if you weren't allowed to complain about the Falcons. That's basically all I do, is complain about the Atlanta Falcons. I'm just saying, maybe we should temper our expectations a little bit. And accept that this is going to be a little bit of a work in progress, especially given that we're in only phase 2. At least I think we're only in phase 2 of a 3-phase rebuild. So we shouldn't be holding them to these super lofty expectations, especially at this point in the season. And, to me, it's more about, let's diagnose the problems, which is what I was hoping I was doing at the early part of this episode, as opposed to just complaining about the problem. So again, it's more than acceptable for you to have a different perspective on that. I'm just telling you what my perspective is, and I'm trying to embrace that perspective, and I guess we'll see how long that lasts. But that's going to do it for us here on today's episode. I know we usually answer questions as well on this Q&A. Sorry for those of you that sent in questions. I know, Jerron, you sent in the question. I do want to answer that. That's a little bit more involved than necessarily what we can do on less than 30 minutes on today's episode. But, I think maybe we'll do a Saturday mailbag exclusive episode as well. So if you didn't send any questions yet, there's still time for you to do so. And of course, if you are also a subscriber to our subtext, link in the description below, you will also get priority on that upcoming mailbag. So just another reason to go check that out. But if you want to send in questions, of course, subtext is the place to go. The Discord is also the place. Link in the description below. You can send an email to lockedonfalcons@mail.com, or you can hit me up on Twitter @LockedOnFalcons. So guys, that's going to do it for us here today. Appreciate the everydayers. Continue to make us a first listen. Tomorrow, your first listen should be a crossover Thursday with Locked On Packers host Peter Bukowski, as we turn our attention to this week 2 matchup, talking about the pressure and other factors. I'll probably watch the film between now and then of their week 1 game against the Bears to get more in depth on that. So you can stay tuned for that as your first listen tomorrow. And for your second listen today, of course, check out the Locked On NFL. Aaron Rodgers out for the year, potentially with the Achilles. So what's next for the Jets? Other stories, all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.